All righty. Today we have an enrichment from one of our birding volunteers that comes out once a year and helps Colleen Crank with her mist netting here on site whenever she does her fall mist netting. Jean, how many years have you been helping Colleen out with this?
Oh, for as long as she's been doing it, I think, almost. Yeah.
Yeah, she's been doing it for quite a while. So very appreciative of you doing that for us. But Jean is actually here today to talk to us about another initiative that she takes on. Jean, would you mind giving an introduction to yourself about what you do and what BirdSafeSTL does? And you can
Sure.
share your screen with me.
I'll give a real brief introduction because I'll cover what the BirdSafe St. Louis project is later in the talk. But I am Jean Favara. I'm Vice President of Conservation for St. Louis Audubon Society. And as such, I also sit on their board. I've been on the board for, I think, close to 6 years now. To be honest, it's been a while. So I enjoy it. I love birds. And I got into looking at the problems of glass collisions and light and how that is dangerous to birds probably a couple of years ago now. And that's what my talk will focus on today.
All right, and thank you so much, Jean. And this is primarily our Blitzinger volunteers that you'll be speaking with. So hopefully, maybe potentially get some volunteers that might want to participate in BirdSafeSTL as well.
Great.
All right, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, and James, I will anticipate that if we get any questions in the chat or something like that, if you could just give me a heads up. I don't mind being interrupted. I'm guessing that we're going to take about an hour today between my presentation and any questions that may come up, but I'm happy to be interrupted. It's just that I have a trouble tracking the chat and doing a presentation. So make sure you get James' attention and hopefully he'll wave his hands or ping me or something and say, hey, stop, you had a question.
Yeah, if I feel like the question is relevant to like that point in your presentation, I'll go ahead and unmute and find a good spot to interrupt you.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. The problems of not being able to multitask in Zoom. That's one of my problems. I don't know if that's because I'm old or what, but it is what it is. So let me go ahead and start sharing and make sure you guys see that. Okay.
Look up this training ID, this tab.
All right. So can you see that, James? All right, we're good to go then. All right. I'm going to start my talk in a little bit of a depressing way and sort of as a way to emphasize why the dangers of light and glass are important to birds. And for many of you, you may know, because this hit the news a couple of years ago, some scientists at Cornell in 2019 published work in Science that showed that the United States and Canada had lost 30% of their bird population since 1970. Frankly, this knocked me sideways almost because that is well within my lifetime and probably well within many of our lifetimes that are in this Zoom right now. And we've lost 30% of birds. And likely this is due to habitat loss, changing climate conditions, cat predation plays a role, and indeed collisions play a role. But I just want to start this way to sort of emphasize why we would be looking at collisions here and why it's important to examine this. So today, what I'd like to cover with you is a couple of things. I want to talk to you about what role collisions play in bird population declines. Why is light pollution dangerous to birds? Why is glass dangerous to birds? And you will learn that this has to do with bird biology itself that causes these problems. And I'll talk to you about two projects. One is called Lights Out Heartland, and the other is BirdSafe St. Louis. And both of these projects I'm involved in are working to help protect birds from both glass collisions and light pollution. And I want to end on a positive note, because there are things we each as individuals can do to protect birds in our area. So I'll be ending my talk on that subject. And just a real quick ad here, so forgive me for this, but St. Louis Audubon Society we were the first local chapter of the Audubon Society in the US. We were established in 1915. We have about 3,000 members across the St. Louis metropolitan region, and I'm betting that many of people on this call and the Zoom are probably members. And it covers 11 counties in Missouri and Illinois. And our mission is to create community connection to nature. So that's all some of the things we do as an organization. So one of the reasons why bird biology plays a role in glass and building collisions is bird migration. And for many of you, you probably know that birds do migrate. We have about 3 to 5 billion birds migrate to the United States and Canada every year in the spring and the fall. 70% of our North American bird species are migratory, and out of those, 80% of those birds migrate at night. And one of the reasons a couple of reasons they think birds migrate at night is because it's cooler at night. They can avoid daytime predators, and this would include your hawks who prey on birds, and hawks generally move and migrate during the day. So small birds migrating at night avoid predators. And they use the stars and the moon to navigate. And this is one of the keys that leads to the problem that birds have with light pollution and glass, is that they use the stars and moons to navigate. We'll get into that a little bit later. I wanted to show a migratory bird flyway map, just to give you an idea of orientation of where St. Louis sits. That red star on the map is where St. Louis sits on the Mississippi Flyway. And the Mississippi Flyway is one of our major migratory pathways in the United States. We have about 13 states in that flyway, and it follows mainly the Mississippi River. So as you know, St. Louis sits right on that river. 60% of our North American songbirds use this flyway. 40% of North American waterfowl migrate on this flyway. It's over 325 species that use this flyway to migrate. And as many of you know, during spring migration, most birds are moving from the south to the north. And for our area in St. Louis, the height of that migration, the peak of that migration generally occurs within the first 2 weeks of May for songbirds. Whereas in the fall, when birds are moving south in the fall, north-south in the fall mainly, that migration period can be much more drawn out. So birds can start moving as early as July and go through November in their migration. It just depends on the species. One of the biological things that's driving the early spring or more concentrated spring migration is that the males of many of these species are hurrying up to get up to their breeding territories and to set up territories in those areas. So they're in a bit of a rush in the spring to get up to their territory and start their families. Whereas the fall, they're done raising their kids, they're finished with all that hard work, and they can take a more leisurely path, if you will, to their southern locations. That's a little bit about migration and the fact that the Mississippi Flyway is one of the most active flyway migration pathways in the United States. And recently, some scientists at Cornell Lab of Ornithology did some work looking at the effects of light pollution levels, geography, and radar. And you can use radar to measure bird migration intensity. And they did some modeling around these effects. And this graph that I show you here in the yellow shows the intensity of migration as determined by radar. And you can see that follows pretty much the Mississippi Flyway. The white circles indicate the radar locations. And when they factored in the geography and light pollution levels and these radar intensity as a corollary to bird migration, they were able to determine that St. Louis itself is the 5th most dangerous city for birds during spring migration and the 6th most dangerous city for birds during fall migration. So yes, indeed, St. Louis does sit in an area that can be very dangerous for migrating birds. And we want to talk a little about bird collisions themselves and the scale of the problem. Roughly 600 million birds are killed annually by building collisions. And scientists have shown that about 56% of those collisions occurs at low rises. So those are buildings that are under 4 stories tall, 44% at residences. And the thing to keep in mind with that number is, although 44% is lower than 56%, there's a lot more residences in our suburban and urban areas than there are low rises or high rises. So they do provide fortunately contribute to our bird collisions occurring. Less than 1% of collisions occur at high rises, but their birds per building mortality rate is highest. And often it's those high rises that have the media coverage. So we hear a lot more about those mortality events. And what is the problem of light to birds? Since birds migrate at night, they use the stars and moons for navigation. They can become disoriented and confused by bright lights and sky glow. And they're drawn to land in dangerous urban and suburban areas because of that sky glow. And this can be especially dangerous when there is a low cloud ceiling and bad weather. And we often get high mortality events at those times. One example I wanted to talk a little bit about that I think most of us have heard about is the Twin Tower Memorial in New York City. And many of you know that this memorial was established to memorialize the fact that we had over 3,000 deaths occur on September 11th. And what it is 2 towers of light that are pointed up to the sky. These lights are very, very strong, high intensity lights. They can be seen for almost 4 miles up. It wasn't very long before they discovered that they had birds getting caught into these spotlights. And you can see in this picture here, all these white dots shown in these 2 beams of light are birds. And so the birds were getting caught in those spotlights, and they would just continue to fly around the spotlights. And they don't really know why this is happening other than it's an observation that was made. So New York City, Audubon, and the Twin Tower Memorial Foundation started to collaborate to deal with this problem. And basically, volunteers from New York City Audubon actually sit down when the September 11 memorial lights are turned on, and they do counts of birds in these beams of light. And when those counts reach 1,000 birds, the Twin Tower Memorial turns off those beams of light for a certain amount of time. Those birds that are stuck in those spotlights are released and they fly on. So it's a collaboration between New York City Audubon and Twin Tower Memorial Foundation to help protect birds while still being able to use these lights on September 11th to memorialize this event. But it is an illustration of how bright lights can confuse birds, especially during migration. Another interesting set of data came out recently from another group, Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the Field Museum in Chicago. And I want to draw attention to this graph here. They had that unusual event where they could look at 2 decades, 20 years of collision data and various migration measures such as light output and wind conditions. And they were looking at one single large urban Chicago building, Corbett Place at Lakeside Center. And they were able to show basically in this data, highlighted in the circle on this bar graph, these are the number of birds that collided with windows while lights were on in the building. Window lighting was on over 20 years. And this bar shows the number of birds per day that collided with the building when the lights were off over that 20-year period. So this data set is unusual because it's such a long amount of time, and it is looking at a single building and focusing on light. And what they found is there were 3 factors that seemed to determine the effect or affect the number of collisions at this building. The magnitude of nocturnal migration, in other words, how many birds were moving through the area, the amount of light output from the building itself, and wind conditions. So 3 things were affecting how many birds were colliding with this building at night. They also were able to do some modeling, and they showed that having the lighted window area, having the amount of lighted window area decreases window collisions by 11-fold in the spring and 6-fold in the fall. And this was published in 2021. And it basically shows again that light does play a role in birds colliding with buildings. So one of the things that came out of this, yeah, go ahead.
Before you move on from that, we had a question come to me. It's not showing up in the main chat. It was a direct question, but one of the volunteers was wondering if daylight savings time might have any effect, if that's been looked at all, because technically if we're shifting our times, like maybe lights would be on longer, or, you know, it's certain times a year, you know, if we're into daylight savings, you know, nighttime for humans is showing up earlier, so lights would probably be on longer than normal, or at least an hour longer. And if there was any kind of, if that's been studied at all.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I have not seen any studies looking at that specifically. So I don't have a direct answer for that, but that is a great question. Any other questions I should work with right now while we're paused?
Nope. That's the only one that's come in so far.
Okay, thank you. So that leads me to one of the projects I wanted to talk about, Lights Out Heartland. This is a project that's led by Don Ficken, who is the president of the Missouri chapter of the International Dark Sky Association. And it is a collaboration of organizations from the heartland in the United States. And basically the point is to reduce light pollution during bird migration periods. And we're doing it through 2 ways, education and outreach. And we're actually have built a system where buildings can enroll in lights out periods from May and September to provide safe passage for birds migrating. And St. Louis Audubon Society is a partner with this project. And there are different ways you can be involved in this organization. One is as a program partner, and program partners focus on raising awareness with the public on the importance of reducing light pollution to help birds safely navigate. And we have about 17 program partners to date. And what I'm doing today is an example of what a program partner might do, going out and making people more aware of the problem. In addition to that, we have building partners. They agree to turn off or dim unneeded building lights during the months of May and September. So those are the months that we're focusing on to help protect birds. May is our most high intensity migration month, generally in this area in the spring. September is generally the start of our fall migration. And because fall migration is so spread out, we decided to choose September to start. And then hopefully as we get more people enrolled, more people aware of the problem, perhaps we can ask for more time from our buildings here. And we have 14 building partners today. The Gateway National Park is one of our building partners. And you may know that they actually have floodlights that light up the arch at night. And this was to make the arch visible and pretty and add to the St. Louis skyline. Unfortunately, those spotlights can also confuse birds, and they agreed to turn off those spotlights again in May and September to help birds as they migrate. So we talked a little bit about light and the dangers of light pollution. I also want to touch on another danger for birds, and that boils down to the dangers of glass and design, building design. The bottom line is that birds don't see glass as an obstacle. So birds foraging near buildings with glass, they can try fly through the glass or flying to reflected vegetation. So windows have two properties which cause problems for birds, and that's reflectivity. So they can reflect, for example, mirrored grass can reflect vegetation like a tree. Or if the glass is transparent, birds think they can fly through those transparent pieces of glass. In addition, the design of buildings can affect birds, such as canyons and walkways that can trap birds and lead them to become confused and can be dangerous for birds. So that also leads me to the second project I want to talk about, and that is our St. Louis Audubon Society BirdSafe St. Louis project. It's one that I lead. And the goal is to establish long-term community relationships that will support bird-safe practices and reduce bird fatalities due to light pollution and glass and window collisions. So one way we do this is through collaborating and being a partner with Lights Out Heartland. And another way is working directly to understand what is happening for mortality, bird mortality in downtown area of St. Louis. And we built this project on previous St. Louis Audubon Society mortality surveys that were run from 2000 to 2003. And I also worked with BirdSafe KC, which is another program very similar to ours. They had started their program earlier than we did here in St. Louis. And it's run by Missouri River Bird Observatory, the borough's Audubon Society, and Johnston County Community College. And they helped me get groups going here, get the project going here. And we have done bird mortality surveys in the fall of 2020, starting in the fall of 2020. And we've done them in the spring and the fall of 2021. And I'll spend a few minutes with you talking about this project. So for our fall surveys, we generally do it from September 1st to October 15th. Our spring surveys run mid-April to end of May. We do our surveys with volunteers. They're done 3 times a week in the morning on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Our volunteers work in pairs, and we search around buildings only using publicly accessible areas around those buildings to look for dead birds. We also record any birds, dead or injured birds that we find in the process of looking around of our buildings that may not necessarily be a formal part of the survey. We use iNaturalist as our data collection platform. This allows ease of use for our volunteers because you can collect the data right there while you're doing the survey. And it also allows bird ID knowledge is not to be required to participate because the ID for these birds, these carcasses, can come through iNaturalist. It doesn't have to, you don't have to be able to ID the birds yourself. Where are these surveys occurring? This is a picture, a slide showing our downtown survey area. And you can see it's roughly an 8x8 block area that we've split up into a west survey area and an east survey area. Those buildings that are shaded in blue are survey buildings. And that has changed a little bit over time, but in general, we have around 25 to 26 buildings we're surveying. The survey groups, teams work in groups of 2, so 2 works in the west and 2 works in the east, and this is done as a walking survey. So as I mentioned, any incidental birds that are found between these buildings are also recorded at the same time. So I'd like to spend a little time with you looking at some numbers from these surveys, some data from these surveys. And this is a graph showing our total number of birds found during our fall 2020 mortality surveys. And this was our first time doing these surveys. We had over 235, we had 235 total observations or total birds found. I just want to point out a couple of things. One is that in this case, throughout our survey period, we did find birds every day for this particular migration period, as little as 1 bird and as high as 23 birds, which was our highest day for finding dead birds. The other thing I want to point out though is I've starred some of these bars with a red star. shown here and here. I only did that because these are our Sunday morning surveys. And I wanted to highlight the fact that there are 3 nights that occur before these Sunday surveys. So you could argue that the high numbers sometimes seen on these days are due to the fact that birds are accumulating over time. And that's in contrast, to the bars without the stars, which indicate data where 2 nights were before the survey was done. So I want to point that out. Another thing I wanted to point out was the fact that we track what is known as migration intensity using birdcasts, and the website is shown on this slide. And birdcasts is using technology such as radar and weather conditions to predict whether you will have a high migration intensity in your area on a given night. And you can literally go out into this website, type in your city name, and it will give you a migration intensity prediction. And often our high migration intensity predictions were followed by the next morning finding a lot of dead birds. So that we did find a correlation between those 2 things. The next slide is looking across 2 survey seasons, and this would be fall 2020 and spring 2021, and the number of collisions at each building that we surveyed. And this gets a little more interesting because things begin to pop out pretty quickly. One of the things I wanted to point out is this building here, which I've labeled Building 11. And you can see that across both the fall and the spring survey collision data, that this building has one of our highest consistent bird mortality rates of all our buildings that we survey. And that's consistent across, actually it's now also consistent, I don't have it on this data set, but from our fall 2021, this building is still our highest, causes the highest collisions. Our second highest building is here called Building 21. And again, it's pretty consistent across our survey seasons. And when I'll talk to you, I'll show you some pictures of this buildings and we'll talk about why that may be in just a minute. But I also wanted to take a minute and point out this data set here. And although the amount of dead birds found is certainly less, what's interesting about this building, Building 19, is the fact that the blue bar represents the data from fall 2020. And shortly after fall 2020, this building has both a high-rise component and a low-rise component. And the low-rise component of this building went under construction, and they are actually redoing the facade of the low-rise portion of the building. So much of that was boarded, including the windows on that building between fall 2020 and the spring 2021. And you can see by the red bar that we certainly decreased the amount of birds there. With the blue bar, it's about 21 birds were found, and the red bar, it went down to 8. So it'll be interesting to see as they finish that construction and that low rise of that portion of the building is opened up again, whether those numbers will rebound once the windows are no longer covered. So here's some pictures of those buildings that I was just talking about. Building 11, which is one of our higher buildings with the highest bird collisions here, is shown here. And Building 21, which is also a high collision building, is shown here and is a low-rise building. And this building, Building 8, is one of our high colliding buildings and has both a low-rise and a high-rise. You only see the high-rise component here. Building 21 is a low-rise building, less than 4 stories. And Building 11 is both a high-rise, shown here and over here, and a low-rise component to this building. But I think you can see something pretty quickly when you're looking at all 3 of these buildings. You see both low-rise and high-rise components. You see a large amount of reflective glass in all of these buildings. Whoops. And often you see vegetation planted next to this reflective glass. And interestingly, scientists have done study in Minneapolis looking at building strikes there. What they show is basically that it's the amount of glass, area and glass, and how much vegetation is planted within 50 meters of that glass that are often the best predictors of how many birds collide with that building. And I guess I should make sure that when I talk about birds colliding, we are also recording birds that are not killed, they're simply stunned. So this is both stunned birds or injured birds and killed birds. So all of these buildings shown in these pictures pretty much highlight the problem, the amount of glass, large reflective amount of glass, and vegetation planted close to that glass.
Is building 11 and 21 lit up in any special way, aside from maybe just interior lights lighting the building up at night?
That's a good question, James. We actually had volunteers go downtown and take night photos of these buildings. And interestingly, they aren't as lit up as you might anticipate. But for example, building 11, I think out of this tall tower section, there was maybe one floor that was lit that you could see from the outside, but the rest of it was dark. So, and that brings up one of the issues with this type of survey. The way I've set up these surveys is I've asked the volunteers to start surveying close to light. So I'm not asking them to go down with a flashlight and start before it gets light. For me, it's much of a safety issue as anything else. So when we collect these birds, and it can take up to 2 to 4 hours to do these survey, although they may start when it's just light, they can be 3 to 4 hours post sunrise, still doing a survey. So when we find dead birds, we can't differentiate whether that bird hit at night per se, or did it hit glass when it was awake in the morning and found itself in this urban suburban landscape, found a tree nearby a building and tried to forage, and then hit that building, hit that glass when it was foraging. So that's a question I can't really answer with this data set directly. I can only tell you that those collisions occur. So does that answer your question, James, a little bit?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Sure. So again, looking at our survey data set so far for fall 2020, we had 235 observations. Spring 2021, we had 183 observations, and then fall 2021, we had 263 observations. And this is actually tracks pretty well with other people who do this type of work. As far as they're pretty consistently, you see more collisions, unfortunately, in the fall than you do in the spring. And basically it boils down to the fact you've got more birds migrating, because during the fall, you've got both the adults and then you have the young that were born that year moving. So there's more birds moving in the fall than there in the spring. One other interesting thing that's come out of this work is, and this is data out of iNaturalist, you can see here this is the fall 2020 data and pictures of our top 10 species that we found during our surveys. And the top one is the ovenbird, and number 5 turns out to be the common yellowthroat, and that's for fall 2020. And when we look at spring 2021, lo and behold, our number 1 species is the ovenbird. And again, the common yellowthroat is up there in number 2. And doing a little bit of reading about this, as far as species effects and why the ovenbird, for example, would probably be found most often, is there is an understanding that the ovenbird, this is not just a mere fact that there's more ovenbirds flying out there. So it's not just because there's lots of ovenbirds migrating, but the ovenbird is a ground species warbler. So they tend to fly lower than most other birds. The other thing that is interesting is they look at what they call these species that are often show up more in these mortality surveys. They call them super colliders. And the other, another characteristic of these birds is that these are birds that actually talk while they're migrating. So some of these warblers that migrate at night also have night-specific migration calls. So there are people who study, literally can study migration intensity by putting microphones on top of buildings and recording what birds they hear flying at night. And ovenbirds is a bird, a warbler species that talks or calls and has night migration specific calls at night. And it turns out many of these night migrating birds that call at night often tend to be what they call super colliders. So again, a little bit about the biology. The other thing I'd like to do is to emphasize that unfortunately, the numbers we're looking at here are likely a high underestimate of the birds that do die or collide in the downtown area, because we're not doing daily checks. Basically, I chose Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday because I thought that was reasonably what I could ask volunteers to do. And we are battling things such as maintenance crews of the buildings in the city. Sometimes birds are cleaned up before we can get to them. Sometimes we're able to work with those crews and actually get the birds from them before they're cleaned up. So that works too. We're only doing surveys on publicly accessible areas. So we can't go to courtyards that are locked off to us in some of these buildings. And of course, we're not always finding the sunbirds that fly away. So it's likely a pretty good underestimate of how many birds are out there on a given survey day and throughout a survey season. However, it has been very helpful to identify the buildings and structural components that are impacting bird mortality in our survey area. And I really have to put a plug in for the community scientists and volunteers. This work obviously would not be possible without that major contribution. So many thanks to the folks that work with me on this project. So now I want to change gears, and this might be another good time to do a quick pause and see if there are any other questions I should address, James.
Yes, so we just actually had one that came in that you're about to cover of what can we do at our own homes. But before that, we had Mary who asked, who are the building partners that you have aside from the Gateway Arch that you had mentioned?
So the other building partners we have about 5 buildings, some from the St. Louis County government, and they actually passed a resolution in the spring of 2021 supporting Lights Out Heartland, and subsequently we had 5 of their buildings, government buildings, enrolled. We've got a church enrolled who approached us about enrolling. The Gateway Arch has been enrolled, and we have the Central Library from the city libraries enrolled. So those are some examples of buildings so far. Any other questions I can address at this point?
We just got another one in. Are Christmas lights a problem?
Probably not, because of the type of lighting it is. I think for home lighting, Christmas lights, unless it's a very high intensity light, are probably less of an issue. Although in conglomerate, you might be able to argue that that also is a problem. But I think with some of the other things that we could do as homeowners, that is less of a problem than some of the other things that we tend to light up. Often we light our homes because it's architecturally pleasing to do so. It makes our house look pretty. It's not necessarily a safety issue. And this next slide will talk about a few of the things that you can do as an individual to look at your home and reduce light pollution.
Yeah, and the timing might also be beneficial that, well, hopefully you're not putting your Christmas lights up in October. I know sometimes you see people doing it, but
yeah, you're absolutely right. Hopefully most of our migrants have moved through by November and are where they should be by December.
And you'll probably get into this with the current slide that you're on here. Is LED lighting better or worse? If you're going to answer that anyways, you can come back to it.
Yeah, it depends on what type of LED lighting. So LED lighting has become more popular, and it rightfully so, because it saves energy. You get more light for less energy. However, because of that, many people have upped the intensity of their light because they can. So they tend to go for LEDs that emit more light than they necessarily need at a given spot, because it still costs them less than their original lighting.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with LED. And also the type of LED also deals with whether it's a warm light or a cool light. And basically warmer colors are better to prevent light pollution than cool colors, your blues. So keep that in mind.
And
But that is a nice introduction to this slide.
Yep.
Things that you can do. I'm sorry, James, did I?
Well, no, I was going to say a couple more have come in, but I'll just wait till the end, I think, on these ones.
Okay. So this slide right here covers some of the things that you can do as an individual about light pollution at your house. There is a way to self-certify your home as dark sky friendly, and I show that website here that takes you through a checklist and allows you to look at your home lighting and deal with any issues that you find there that basically boil down to using too much light for too long. You can save birds energy and money by doing this. They're recently set up, Don recently set up advantage of free training. So he set up a train the trainer group where you can take some training, which is going to be offered in March. And it's for volunteers, and it will teach you how to talk about this subject and of light pollution, how you can work with others to help them become more aware of the problem. And you can help get the word out about dangers of light pollution to your neighbors and your community. And of course, you can volunteer with the BirdSafe St. Louis Community Scientist Survey Project. That's an option too. Just a quick minute, because I don't want to read this slide to you, but here's 5 principles for responsible outdoor lighting at homes or anywhere, actually. All light should have a clear purpose. You need to know whether that light you have out is really needed. How the use of that light will impact an area, for example. Light should be only directed where it is needed. So for most cases, you want that light to be targeted down. Any light that's not shielded and then just targeted goes up as well as down is likely a source of light pollution. And there is such thing as light trespass. So if you are unfortunate enough to live with a neighbor who has a very bright light on the side of their house for some reason, you can understand it comes into your window. That's actually a light trespass. So you don't want to trespass using light, period, or trespass anyway. So light can also have light trespass. You should use lights that are no brighter than necessary. So this goes back to the LED question. How much light do you really need at that spot? And be aware that many people say, but I need the high intensity light for safety. I don't have this slide in this deck, but there is a slide that shows that with increasing high intensity light, for example, on top of your garage, which is often where we have outdoor lighting, you also increase the amount of shadow. So someone could be standing near your house and you wouldn't see it with a high intensity light, whereas if appropriate intensity light with less shadowing, you can see that person. So keep in mind, brightness doesn't always equate to safety. That's a false narrative, if you will, with light. And light should only be used when it's useful. So you can imagine using things like timers or motion sensors to help with that. And you also want to use warmer colors when you can. How about glass? So we talked about light. Now let's talk about what you can do about glass collisions. I've told you that birds can't see glass like we do, so they don't see it as a barrier. So you have to put patterns on the glass so they can see it. And there is the 2 by 4 inch rule or the 2 by 2 inch rule. And both of these rules indicate that horizontal patterns on the glass should be 2 inches apart. Vertical patterns should be 4 inches apart. And the best place to put that pattern is on the outside of the glass or your window. If you do use vertical patterns 4 inch apart, you'll protect most birds. A 2 by 2 inch pattern will protect hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are small enough that the 2 by 4 inch rule, they won't see that as a barrier, whereas a 2 by 2 inch rule, they will. There are many solutions with a lot of varying costs and a variability in their durability also. I recommend that you check out the American Bird Conservancy website, which I've given that URL here. And they actually have efforts to test products. So they have ways to test products and get to give you a readout as to whether a particular product is good for protecting birds against class collisions. And the pictures on the slide cover two ways you can protect birds. One's Encompassing bird savers, which is, if you can see it, it's basically a string that is mounted on the outside of your window. And these, again, are a vertical pattern. They can be done 4 inches apart, and they'll protect birds from colliding from that window. And you can even use temporary solutions, such as tempera paint, which is shown here, which could be put up during the main high migration intensity periods in May and September, and then easily washed off. So those are two other solutions. Other things you can do to prevent glass collisions is close your blinds. I show a picture of that here. That is an imperfect solution, but it's better than nothing, because what that does, it does create a pattern, but you can still see the reflection of vegetation on the outside of this window. So although it will reduce collisions, it probably won't eliminate them on this window. Other things you can do is learn more. So there's a book recently published by Dr. Daniel Plum, who has done a lot of research on glass collisions. And reading that book called Solid Air and sharing this information with your neighbors and friends can be helpful to protect birds. And when you think about feeding your birds, consider where your feeder placement is and where you're placing those feeders. And although this might be counterintuitive, and I know you can't see the details with this graph, but feeder placement for windows in relationship to windows, the closer to the window, the better. And here's the thought. Basically, the farther from the window, the more chance the bird can be flushed from the bird feeder and gather enough steam or speed to hit that window, versus if it's only 1 meter away, which is the far left-hand corner of this graph, it's less likely to have enough steam or speed to hit a window if it flushes from the feeder, versus being 10 meters. And 10 meters is roughly 30 feet. 1 meter is roughly 3 feet. And the safest place to have feeder is often right next to your window, because they just don't slam into the window if they're flushed from a feeder. So these are some simple steps that you as an individual can take to prevent bird collisions in your home. I want to show you some examples of organizations and buildings that have worked to protect their windows. And this includes St. Louis Zoo, which has put up applications on its windows. You can see the lines here to prevent bird collisions. It includes Litzinger Ecology Center, which picture shown here, where I believe some interns that worked at the center actually worked hard to do this 4x4 inch pattern using dots that they painted on the outside of the window, I believe. And I'm sure James can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then also the Audubon Center at Riverlands recently installed some dots on their windows. They have very large windows that overlook Ellis Bay to help protect from bird collisions. So these are all things done. Johnson Community College is interesting because that picture is shown here. It's one of the few places that actually has done pre and post window mitigation studies, where Crystal Anton, who is works in their sustainability department at the community college, has volunteers, student volunteers that did surveys before the window installations and afterwards. And basically she has shown that she can have a 98% reduction of bird collisions at the community college windows by installation. This is actually etched glass. So these dots are etched into the glass, and that prevents the majority of their window collisions using that product. And that's really the end of my talk. But I do want to open it up to your questions, and thank you for your attention today, and thank James for the opportunity to talk to you about the dangers of light pollution and glass collision to birds. And also invite you, if you'd like to volunteer with the Bird Safe St. Louis project, you can contact me at the email address shown here. And I also listed some resources that you can do a little bit of homework on the dangers of light and glass collisions and what you can do to help protect against that. And James, I think that's it for me, besides going through some questions or talking to the group about any thoughts or ideas they might have.
All right, yes, we got quite a few questions already that we're just starting to build up. And I did want to say that it was a big team effort in getting our windows done. We have so many windows. I think it's like 40 plus of those really big windows. Allison led the team on getting those cleaned up so we could get the paint on them. And she was researching what different methods we could do. And we came up with just the paint, acrylic paint, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, just acrylic paint that can easily be scraped off of glass. And our interns, Emily and Keegan, who are still with us and going to be leaving us shortly, but our fall interns into our winter interns got those dots done. But yeah, so a big team effort, but it took a lot of time. But so far, I'm going to have to only knock on some fake wood here, but no issues yet. We've seen no bird collisions. All right. What threat are wind turbines?
Actually, it's kind of interesting. This morning I was reviewing some of the papers on collisions and birds. It turns out one paper that was published in 2015 actually indicates wind turbines was one of the least problems for birds right now, as of 2015. So building collisions was actually the kind of the order of dangers to birds right now. Habitat loss is number one. That's no big surprise. Number two, interestingly, scientists have said that probably predation by free roaming ranging cats may be the second biggest danger to birds. Yeah. Number three is building collisions, and then it goes down from there. Above wind turbines right now is more of collisions with power lines, and that includes both just collisions and electrocutions from power lines. So it'll be interesting though, because it brings up an important point. As we try to move to carbon neutral technology for energy production, obviously wind is going to be taking on a larger role. And we'll have to be very careful for St. Louis Audubon Society and for many of the Audubon organizations will tell you that we support wind technology, and we do. We have to, because it's going to be key to moving away from producing carbon. However, the siting of those facilities is going to be critical. There's going to be, and there has been groups like the Nature Conservancy who has done modeling in looking at across the United States to try to determine the best places for those wind turbines to exist. Willy-nilly siting is a problem because where birds move a lot, you're likely to kill them using turbines. So it's a good question.
Jack asks, does Jean have any experience with a liquid bird protector called Window Alert? You apply it on the window outside in a straight line and it dries to an almost clear spot. Used along with decals. My experience is good so far, but too early to tell.
No, I don't. So I would love to learn more about that. I looked into some outside window applications that were painted on, and the issue that I found as I dug a little deeper was that many of them, it's not clear how long they'll last. So that was the only caveat I remember reading about, but if that person would like to contact me directly, I'd like to learn more about their direct experience and understand more about that.
All right. And Martha Schmidt wanted to clarify, it is low-rise buildings that are the big problem, correct?
In total, it's your low-rise and your residential buildings that are likely most problematic.
Yeah, your slide earlier said 56% for the low-rise buildings and less than 1% for high-rise, correct?
Absolutely. So we hear about more of them, the high-rise, simply because what happens is often if there is a low cloud ceiling during bad weather, there are high mortality events at this high-rise. So you'll get hundreds of birds on a single night. That hits the press. The 20 birds found at the low-rise building don't make the press. Yeah. So we hear more of those high-rise collision events.
And Tom asked, and this might have been before you actually put up there, because it sounded like motion activated lighting is more helpful than an issue, correct?
Correct. So if you feel like you need to light an area for safety reasons, having that light only come on when there's movement is better than having that light on all the time, because you don't necessarily need it all the time.
If you rarely find birds near your home, can you assume your windows are not a big problem?
No, and I'm glad whoever asked that question, thank you, because I forgot to say this. 20 to 50% of your strikes leave no evidence. So you may never know that you actually had a bird hit a window unless they hit hard enough, they leave a pattern on your glass, or you're present to hear it, which unfortunately I've had happen once to me in my own home. But otherwise, 20 to 50% of the time, you have no idea a bird has hit that glass. And in addition to that, we have outside predators that clean things up that die at our windows. So we may not find those. And so there's a lot of reasons you may not see the event happening.
Are there any species-specific collision studies?
It's a good question. And the only reading I've done has been a little bit about why the ovenbird seems to be a bird that likes or has trouble with buildings. And then there's a lot of hand waving around that bird's biology as to why that might be. But I haven't seen a definitive study. And I'm assuming the person is kind of asking from the angle of why specific species would be more likely to collide.
Yeah, that's what I would be assuming. What is the best way to work with our municipalities? Celeste says we have lighted tennis courts.
Yeah. That is something that I am still learning about, and we are still learning about. When I say we, I'm talking about partners in Lights Out Heartland and St. Louis Audubon Society. Often you really just have to start building the relationships to whoever controls that lighting and making them aware of the problem and making them aware of the options. A lot of people don't even know birds migrate at night. That is a revelation for a lot of people. And then once you may help them discover that biological aspect of birds and why light would impact that, at least they're able to make that connection. So I would encourage that person to work, to find a person within whoever controls that lighting situation to start building that relationship and talking about this problem. And it's slow and sometimes frustrating work. So for instance, in our bird surveys on these buildings, we obviously have a pretty good data set and we know what buildings cause the most problems downtown. Knowing that and being able to affect change are sometimes two very different things. And the other layer of complication we have downtown is that these buildings are often owned by a separate management company, managed by a separate management company, and then the tenants in that building are a third set of people. And so you kind of have to dig through who you're going to work with to try to affect change, The other layer we have experienced is that we started these surveys in the fall of 2020. Well, we all know what happened in the spring of 2020. COVID hit, and very few people are working in these buildings right now. So the tenants have kind of left the building, so to speak. So even trying to reach in and get somebody who's there on a daily basis to care has gotten to be more difficult because they're not there. They're not in the buildings. So I don't, that's a lot of excuses, but that's the reality that can be, you just have to take one small victory at a time and one relationship at a time.
Yeah, I think, where change is going to be, probably made the best here would be getting this data, being able to share it out wide enough to where it might affect change of buildings in the future. Because I can imagine, even if you got somebody who wanted to, like in that building 11, if you got somebody who was interested in wanting to make some change, like the management company or the owner actually says, yeah, let me hear some ideas. I mean, it'd probably be so costly that they might be like, well, I was interested, but now I'm not, once they see the cost of, something like that.
I mean, you're right, James. It's could be costly. One of the things we're trying to do in the data set, and I didn't talk about this, is for our 4 buildings with the highest strike numbers, I'm asking our volunteers to record specifically estimating what bank of windows they think that bird hit. So if I'm ever able to go into a company and say, if you deal with this bank of windows, I think you'll eliminate 50%, 50 to 60% of your strikes, then at least allow them to focus on a bank, not the entire sprawling building that is probably problematic, but at least if I can get them to address a set of 5 windows, up the building and that. So that I'm trying to address it in that way, but you're right. Retrofit is always harder than dealing with the future. So you have both the idea of trying to get the retrofits done and the mitigations done, but another effort that we need to focus on is to have ordinances passed that will support bird-friendly buildings and components in those buildings in the future. So we can't give up on either one of those.
Yeah, very nice. We have some thank yous for covering this and all the resources that you're providing. And Mary also suggests too, for our one, who was it, Celeste, who had asked about the, like things like the tennis courts, and suggesting timers to like your municipalities. Once you've been able to convince them, like you said, Gene, of trying to do something, timers would probably be a good way to go about it. I know so many like sports fields and stuff around St. Louis that'll just leave their lights on like all night long.
And you know what? Another thing, as far as glass versus light, I have always thought about lighting to be a little bit more low-hanging fruit, because it seems to be it's easier to talk about saving energy, aka saving money, and protecting birds than it is asking you to do something, apply something to your window, which costs you effort and money to protect birds. Versus lighting, I can always use the angle, hey, you'll save birds, you'll save money, you'll save energy. And that's a little bit more low-hanging fruit. So it might be an angle you can consider taking when you're specifically talking about lighting ball fields, those type of things.
Yeah, Martha is saying, yeah, convincing architectural firms to care might help in the future. Yeah, definitely. And aside from that, I think we're just getting a bunch of thank yous. Does anybody have any other questions? And feel free to unmute and ask your question too, if you'd like.
Hey, James, I know you mentioned that this recording would be put out on YouTube. Does it help you at all if I also create a PDF file of this presentation that can be shared somehow?
I mean, it might be useful. Yeah. I mean, if people want to have,
yes, please.
Yeah, the resources accessible, because then they'd be able to click right on the links. So I'd say,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll send you a PDF copy of this presentation, James.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm getting lots of thank yous and great presentation. Well, thank you so much, Gene. It truly was very informative and well laid out.
Great, I
That's
appreciate it.
fantastic.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys, and feel free to contact me if any of you have any questions afterwards. I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. And of course, if you're interested in volunteering with the project, BirdSafe St. Louis project, or Lights Out Heartland, contact me and I'll put you in touch with the right people.